Well, now it's 10:15, and time for Disgusted Tunbridge Wells, introduced by Derek Robinson.
The most stupid, aimless discussion I have ever heard on radio is the way Mrs. Carol Rickman of Bilth Wells, Powys, describes A Word in Edgeways broadcast yesterday week, and she goes on to prove her point with some skillful analysis.
Brian Redhead, who chaired the discussion, was desperately trying to keep any sort of conversation going, however absurd, with the result that in a space of a few minutes it ranged from the classlessness of rock climbing and most other sports to whether washing machines were luxuries or necessities. The method of dealing with laundry in Tibetan villages came in somewhere. Apart from this garbage, the woman taking part in the discussion was incapable of delivering a single complete sentence, and proceeded to giggle after vainly trying to make any supposedly serious points, most of them barely audible. I beg you to listen to the tape of this broadcast and then confirm that mine is not an unreasonable criticism.
Duty officer at Broadcasting House logged some very angry calls, too. People used such words as deplorable, puerile, insulting, and rubbish. So I did what Mrs. Rickman suggested and listened to the tape of That Word in Edgeways. The guests were Chris Bonington, Angela Carter, and Roy Fisher. Mrs. Rickman was right. The show was not a success. In fact, at times it was what in radio jargon we call a stinker. It felt like an elderly aeroplane trundling down the runway for 3/4 of an hour and failing to take off. As the producer, Gillian Hush, told me, it was only one in the current series of 26 Words in Edgeways. The show is a spontaneous, unpredictable conversation which sometimes fizzes and this time went flat, and she hopes fervently that it won't happen again. Any Questions is a broadly similar kind of programme, I suppose. Paul Millan of Manchester has been listening to Any Questions for as long as he can remember, but not anymore.
It was a long time before I realised that the reason why so many questions were slanted in a particular way, and the most rabid, irrelevant or vindictive remark was given a rapturous reception, was that the programme emanated from a very conservative, with a small c, catchment, and this had permeated the entire production. This season's programmes have become unbearable. Somehow the whole thing went overboard in a conservative, with a big C, screech-in. If this is just a passing phase, I won't know, because I'll no longer be listening. I think the time has come for the same format to be used on programmes based in Liverpool and Glasgow, so that the working class voice in the major industrial cities where most people live can also be heard.
Audience reaction is a funny thing, Carol Stone, who produces Any Questions, told me. Sometimes the impression the listener gets is very different to the actual feeling in the hall. As for conservative screech-ins, she pointed out that Liberal and Labour voices have been heard loud and clear on the programme this season. The real point of Paul Millan's letter, however, is that Any Questions audiences are not working class. Carol Stone agreed. She wishes it were otherwise, but the hard fact is that the programme gets very few invitations to factories and working men's clubs. And even when she takes Any Questions to, say, an industrial canteen in Glasgow or Liverpool, the shop floor workers mostly stay away, while the white-collar staff turn up in force. I can see that the audience selects itself, but the panel is carefully chosen. J. Ikomi and A.K. Emo of Ilford in Essex don't like the way it's done.
Although questions dealing with black people, immigrants, Africa and the Third World keep cropping up, the composition of the Any Questions panel remains a statutory 3 white men and 1 white woman. There are enough educated, articulate West Indians, Indians, Pakistanis and Africans in Britain today for one of them to be included on a panel. No matter how liberal a white man may be, he has no way of knowing what the black experience is at first hand.
And as an example, they quote the concern of Any Questions panelists for the fate of Jewish dissidents in Russia.
Although many Jews may be seeking to leave the Soviet Union, there is no evidence of the Jews leaving or refusing to go to South Africa, in protest at the thousands of political prisoners on Robben Island, the detentions and murders of blacks at the hands of white policemen, and other barbaric practices.
Powerful stuff. I asked Carol Stone to find out how many non-white panelists had taken part in Any Questions. She came back with the answer: 2. Lord Pitt from Grenada and the late Lord Constantine, the West Indian cricketer. 2 non-white panelists in 30 years of Any Questions. It makes you think. Carol Stone says it's not for want of looking on her part, and in fact Trevor Phillips, the National Union of Students president, who grew up in Guyana, will be one of her team next week. So that'll boost the figures by 50%. Last week I included a letter denouncing the way presenters in news programmes, such as PM, are being allowed to air their own opinions. The changing role of the presenter is clearly something that worries listeners.
I am concerned with the apparent dominance of the news presenters over the news readers. The latter, who have splendid voices, are allowed to say little. The presenters, on the other hand, have indifferent voices and a great deal to say. Why is this? And incidentally, how are the presenters chosen? One of them's a former ladies' cricket captain. Is this qualification essential?
That's from M.V. Bayes of Leamington Spa. J.F. Blick of Brightlingsea, Essex, has long been disgusted by what he calls the implicit bias of news programmes in favour of employers during coverage of industrial disputes.
Workers engaged in industrial action are consistently portrayed either as lunatics or, worse, Marxists, bent on a course of self and national destruction. The employers, however, are presented as level-headed, benign benefactors desperately trying, despite all odds, to break the deadlock and make common sense prevail. This implicit bias now seems to be taking a formal, open form. An item in a recent Today programme was introduced by the presenter with, "And now for some good news." Then proceeded an interview with a wife of a striking Ford worker who was involved in a campaign to encourage the workers to return to work. The interview was concluded with the phrase, "Good luck to her, say we." Can we assume that such a blatant expression of partiality is consistent with an editorial policy on the matter? If so, is the Today programme now a disseminator of propaganda for the Ford Motor Company?
I called the Today programme, and they confirmed J.F. Blick's account. The presenter was Hilary Osborne, and her actual words were, "And now some good news about the Ford strike," to introduce the interview, after which she said, "And good luck to her, say I." Well, I gave those facts to Peter Woon, radio's head of news and current affairs, and I asked him, is that the way a presenter on a news programme should behave?
No, frankly, it isn't. It was a mistake. It was a human mistake, I think. Presenters are human beings and occasionally let slip something which they shouldn't have done. Hilary recognised it immediately after the programme. She's sure it won't happen again. We have had a number of letters ourselves on the point, so the one who's written to you is taking up a point that a number of other listeners quite properly recognised, and we have written to them and said, yes, it was a mistake, and we apologise for it.
Nevertheless, isn't there a danger that the personality cult, if you like, of the presenter is menacing this great reputation which the BBC has for just delivering the news straight?
Yes, I think it's fair to say there's a danger, but we recognise it. I don't think we let it go over the top. Presenters are a link with the listener, and they can become associated with that presenter, recognise that when they switch that programme on, like Disgusted Tunbridge Wells, may I say, they will have an identifiable person there they've got to know over a period of time and will feel confidence in him or her. Our presenters are obviously, in the main, widely experienced people. People like Brian Redhead, who was a former editor of a Manchester paper. John Timpson has gone through the whole gamut of news. Brian Widlake on The World at One. Douglas Stewart, and so on. So our main presenters are enormously experienced journalists, fully aware of all the traps, and in no way do they wish to put their personal opinion on the news across to the listener, and we don't wish them to, and they know that. What they do try to convey is a friendly, familiar link with the listener to try and help the listener through the programme.
I asked Peter Woon what qualifies someone like the former England ladies cricket captain to be a news presenter. He said that Rachel Hayhoe-Flint is an experienced journalist, admittedly on the sports side, but the BBC has another reason for using her and people like Blebby Purvis.
One thing we want to get more women on the air. We recognise that half our audience, at least, throughout most of the day are women, and we don't think we have had enough women broadcasters on radio. That is one thing we're trying to correct. Secondly, they will have with them, on the whole, a much more experienced person, like in the morning, Redhead or Timpson, like in the PM programme, Gordon Clough or Bob Williams.
News magazines themselves are getting longer. For instance, The World at One's due to get stretched by 10 minutes, and the PM programme now lasts almost an hour. Peter Woon pointed out that this is often a matter of restoring time that had previously been cut back. But is there really that much news worth reporting? Q.G. Robinson of Douglas, Isle of Man, thinks not, and he found some evidence to back him up in a recent PM programme.
There was an exciting item about a change in the Executive Committee of the Civil Service Union, and one about truancy from schools in East Sussex. The week before, a branch was raising funds for the Samaritans. Now surely those are local radio material, not of national interest.
And with Radio 4 soon to become Radio 4 UK, it's an even more pointed question. So I asked Peter Woon to answer it.
Frankly, the problem for the journalist is that there's not a shortage of news, there's such an enormous amount of news. You say truancy in East Sussex, that is a local radio story. Now, is it really? Truancy is a problem that exists around the country. The fact that it happened on this occasion to be in East Sussex, we are using it simply as an example, which we are reasonably confident on a story like that will be of interest and concern to people all over the country. The problem exists everywhere. The fact that the particular story is about one place is not the point, I think.
Peter Woon. Now to music. Kathleen Poole of Kingston upon Thames says she's a lover of middle-of-the-road music, like classical, operetta, ballet and so on, and therefore she can't take the drivel usually pumped out by Radio 2.
What seems to me most unfair is that the many people like myself have to be satisfied with a few odd hours during the week on Radio 2 and a couple on Radio 4, but nothing to speak of from Radio 3, who should surely be the ones providing this type of music. Why is Radio 3 allowed to hog a wavelength for 17 hours daily to cater for an elitist audience of 50 to 150,000 listeners? Could they not spare more time for programs of light classical music instead of such a surfeit of the heavy stuff, especially as the controller of Radio 3 admitted in Radio Times that their audience jumps more than threefold when they advertise a Viennese evening? Well, I'm one of those who do the jumping, and I'd like the opportunity to jump to Radio 3 more often. But of course, I should know better. They don't want to attract large audiences, do they?
I talked to Stephen Hurst, controller of Radio 3, and Kathleen Poole may be surprised to learn that he largely agrees with her last remark. His channel does not set out to win big audiences. It wouldn't be difficult to do it. All Radio 3 need do is bash out the surefire classics, play the 1812 Overture every day. Indeed, Stephen Hurst told me, when he became controller, he discovered that Radio 3 had been playing Brahms' Fourth Symphony 18 times a year. Nowadays, favourite giants like that get broadcast no more than half a dozen times a year. That sounds very spoil-sport, but Stephen Hurst explained the thinking behind it. The great strength of Radio 3 is that it doesn't have to satisfy commercial interests. It can play a great range of music in an attempt to please everyone, and that includes musicians and orchestras as well as listeners. Inevitably, pleasing one musical taste antagonises another. Radio 3 does play light classical stuff, Stephen Hurst said. Homeward Bound is light classical, and some of the heavy brigade hate it. But Radio 3's great achievement is to give people something they can't get on record, and that's live broadcasts of concerts. One such was Wagner's Ring Cycle, recently broadcast direct from Covent Garden, all 15 hours of it. When Martin Smith of London E11 saw the spread in Radio Times, he was delighted, thinking,
"What a magnificent show on television." But then I noticed that only radio was broadcasting the work, and I could only despair. After all, even steam radio cannot produce theatrical steam effects.
It wasn't a question of steam, Stephen Hurst told me, it was a question of lasers. The Covent Garden production uses a background screen of laser beams, which means the stage has to be kept relatively dim, and television demands bright lights, so televising it wasn't possible. But there's another Ring Cycle coming up in 1980, and they're hoping for better luck then. Just time for a quick roundup. I've had more letters wishing me luck in my attempt to get the Home Office to talk about the future of VHF. MD Ogle of Chorley in Lancashire and John Horden of Felling in Tyne and Wear are just two listeners urging the need for a separate Radio 1 VHF channel, but the Home Office still declines to speak. I'll keep trying. Christopher Pullum of Leamington Spa is very disappointed to hear that the top 20 is coming off VHF stereo. Relax, Chris, it's just not true. 2 weeks from today, the top 20 becomes the top 40. It'll run from 5 until 7, and it'll still be in stereo. Finally, some good news for N. Jeffs of Ripley. A new series of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is coming up in the new year, and also after Christmas, the news quiz will return, which will please Mrs. Holt of Manchester. As for me, I'll be back next week.
That was Derek Robinson. The programme was produced in Bristol by Carol Stone, and if you'd like to send a letter to it, the address is Disgusted, Tunbridge Wells, BBC Bristol, BS8 2LR, Disgusted, Tunbridge Wells, BBC Bristol, BS8 2LR.